Awesome. All right. Well, welcome to the podcast, and thanks a lot for coming on. It's an honor to talk to you. I'm a big fan of your books, and just a big fan of your work in general. And yeah, it's just awesome to get to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much. You're welcome.
Yeah, of course. So for those who maybe haven't heard of your work before or heard of you before, how would you introduce yourself to those people?
Well, I became interested in electronic music in my youth and in computers. And so that's what I focused on when I finally went to college. And then I worked in the computer industry. And then very quickly, I became the editor of Computer Music Journal, which is the main research journal in the field. And I did that for about 23 years. And I got into research and teaching and writing books. And now I'm just retired.
Do you still work at the university in Santa Barbara? I feel like you mentioned that through email, or is that not the case?
Well, I'm professor emeritus, which means that I still supervise research. I have PhD students and master students that I'm on their committee or chair their committee. And I'm working with a PhD student right now to develop some software. And I'm part of the extended community right now of the university.
Okay, cool. So, also for those who don't know, in 1974, you were the first person to implement granular synthesis on a computer. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, that is insane. So it's like, is it safe to say that you invented granular synthesis, or were you just the first to implement it on computers?
The latter. I mean, I got the idea from my teacher, Yanis Xenakis.
Okay, yeah, I know him.
And he got the idea from the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Dennis Gabor, who wrote some papers in 1946 and 47 about how sound could be analyzed and synthesized in terms of particles of sound. But Xenakis was able to realize one piece with granular synthesis, but it was done with analog technology. That is to say that he recorded several dozen sine tones on analog tape, and then he cut them into little 40 millisecond pieces and put all those pieces for each individual tone into an envelope. And then he composed a score of how to put together Humpty Dumpty together again, all these hundreds and hundreds of snippets of tape. And the chore of assembling all of those little snippets was given to the great electronic music composer Bernard Parmigiani. I had dinner with him in Paris one time, and he told me that he was the one that had to do that drudge work. And that was 1959. So, in fact, I hadn't even heard that when in 1974 I implemented it on a computer. But Xenakis had talked about it in his course, and so I was very motivated to try to realize it.
What is it about it? What was it that drove you to become so interested in granular synthesis specifically?
Well, I was very influenced by the ideas of Edgar Varèse. He had this idea of sound masses, and the idea of sound masses that are moving and that sometimes collide and are either repulsed, or they interpenetrate. And this was a very novel way of thinking about musical structure to me. And I also was very interested in similar structures in the music of Giorgi Ligeti, who created these layers of sound, very thick layers of sound with orchestra and organ. And then Xenakis had his own idea, and he had a theory of granular synthesis based on what he called sound clouds. So it was all this theory and this new territory, new ways of structuring musical mesostructure, or the middle layers of structure that seemed novel and worth exploring.
So how do you think about music now? Like when you sit down to compose music, like what are you trying to achieve, or like how do you think about yeah, I guess just how do you think about music in general? What is like the ideal piece of music to you when you're creating?
Well, that's a tough question to answer verbally. I mean, some composers would answer that by saying, well, the music speaks for itself.
Right.
But I actually attempted to write down some things. Maybe I can try to find that um, about what to listen for in my music.
Sure, yeah, I'd love to hear that. Feel free to find it.
And it's specific to each piece.
Right.
Each piece is exploring different things. So it's not something. I can't give one answer for every piece.
Mm. Is there a general like common thread you think that you seek when trying to make music?
Well, I'm looking. There's a balance between novelty and familiarity. I don't want something that's utterly novel because it will be incomprehensible.
Mm.
And I differ from that from my teacher Xenakis. Xenakis was seeking absolute novelty, and so some of the pieces are very difficult to listen to, but you have to admit that they're completely original and they're completely novel, both in their conception and their sound. I'm thinking of the piece S709, which I heard the premiere of in Paris, and it sounds like an angry insect for about 4 minutes. Very radical, just dares the audience to listen to it. Okay, so I found a text. So first of all, people asked, what should the audience listen for in your music? And I addressed three aspects of what to listen for. How is it made? The planning and construction. What is its shape and how does it unfold? Its form and sonic processes. And what is its meaning or significance? And as I say, my musical corpus is not a monolith. Each piece addresses different aesthetic and technical issues. How is it made? Many composers explain their works by means of systems they design. The system is a structure or process that is used in constructing the work. It takes the form of charts, tables, block diagrams, algorithms, or patches. By its nature, the system is a concept that can be readily explained. Many talks by composers focus on their systems. By contrast, I do not use a system in composing my work. I plan and perform experiments with sound and evaluate their results using taste and intuition. This is an interaction between conscious and unconscious choices. For example, I have a preference for a certain sound. I do not know why. It is an unconscious bias, but then I deploy it in a conscious manner in order to create new structures or solve pre-existing structural problems. So I could go on, but that'll be the short answer.
Right. Yeah, it is kind of impossible to know why we have preferences for certain sounds.
Oh, absolutely not. You have no idea. We have no idea why we love what we love, what we like, why we like what we like, why this tastes good to me and tastes bad to you. It's all unconscious.
Right. I would assume that it's a combination of like maybe some biological factors like the shape of the pinna of your ear, the length of your ear canal, like all that kind of stuff. And then
yeah, right.
Probably like peer influence has a lot to do with it. And then also cultural influence obviously probably has a lot to do with it as well.
Sure, there are cultural and peer influences, but at the end of the day, there's, and you might like the taste of something one day and then not like it the next day, like my cat.
Right. Nice. You're a cat person as well?
Yes.
Yeah, me too. So one thing I'm interested to ask you, because you probably have like a better idea about music technology than anyone I've ever talked to, at least in the history of it. Do you feel like there's any historical milestones in music technology that you feel have been overlooked or underappreciated?
Well, I was teaching up until June of last year, so I did have 18-year-old students in my class, and obviously they haven't seen all of the transitions and changes that have happened. I mean, the big one for me was it happened around 1987 when Apple came out with a computer, the Apple Macintosh II, that you could attach analog to digital and digital to analog converters, good quality. And you had the first sound editors appeared. So all of a sudden we could see the sound. You could have a clip and you could move it along the timeline. And this was just a revolutionary change. Before that, we were working with tape to assemble a piece. Even if or you had to write a computer program in a programming language like Music 11 or C Sound. And designing envelopes was very frustrating. You had to write them out on paper and plot them and then figure out, at point 512, you want the value to be 0.8 and things like that. So all of a sudden, this interactive visual way of assembling sound and the rise of plugins was a huge change. And like I say, that happened around 1987, 88.
So I know that Alan Turing developed a chess program before we had computers that could actually run that chess program. And then once computers became a thing, I think that program was probably built. But did you have any ideas before 1987 that weren't possible at the time that you had the idea? And then when computers came around, were you just like ready to go with ideas for the computer? Or was it kind of like the computer showed up and then you started to get ideas after that about what you could do there?
Right. Well, I first encountered computers in 1971 at the University of Illinois Experimental Music Studio. And I immediately was hooked. I saw it had these glass doors with circuit boards and it had blinking lights. And it just seemed like, oh, I want to play with this toy. So I wanted to buy a computer and a mini computer. And a wise professor, Professor James Beauchamp, counseled me against that because in 1971, I would be starting from absolute scratch, absolute zero, entering ones and zeros into the computer via the front panel. There would be no way to make something useful musically for years and would cost a lot of money. He advised me to get one of the new ARP 2600 synthesizers. And I saw one of the prototypes and I was an early adopter of that. But then when I went to California Institute of the Arts in 1972, I'd already studied with Xenakis. He'd already showed us things that algorithmic composition, the idea of composing music according to a process. And that fascinated me at the time. And that's something I wanted to do. And he also talked about granular synthesis. And I thought, I'd like to take these two ideas of algorithmic composition and granular synthesis and work with a computer. So the day I arrived as a freshman at Cal Arts, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And that was a huge advantage for me as a student.
Nice. When you still like when you sit down to compose, do you still think about making music as like in an algorithmic type of way, or like I guess you said earlier, like all the experiments you do with sound all happen like slightly differently, but in general, is it kind of like you sit down with like a technical idea and then you sort of do this technical technique thing that you've had the idea of, and then once you get a result out of that, you sort of analyze or figure out whether or not you like the result?
Well, I reached a point in my last year of undergraduate studies. I'd spent a couple of years developing a massive program that was very complicated for algorithmic composition. And I won't go into the details, but I wrote my honors thesis on it. It was a 100-page paper. It was very technical. And but I had very few chances to run the program, to debug it, because you were charged money. Every time I ran it, I had to pay $75 to the university.
Wow.
You were charged for computer time in that period. Anyway, when I got to MIT, I had all this data, which was just a printout of text and numbers. And I entered that into the computer, and I synthesized it in 1980 at MIT. And it was the worst thing I ever heard in my life. And I decided that was a kind of an epiphany for me. I decided that I was more interested in beautiful sounds than I was in beautiful algorithms. I was very attracted to the musique concrète people of the GRM, the Groupe de Recherche Musicale in Paris, and those composers. And they weren't using systems. It was all intuitive music. So I use algorithms at the level of sound synthesis. I'm working, we developed a new granulator called Emission Control 2. I work with those algorithms to synthesize
I love that granulator.
Sound. And I've got a new granulator coming out. So I work with algorithms at the level of sound, but not at the level of the mesostructure and the macrostructure. It's handicraft. I use this process that I call multi-scale mixing.
What is multi-scale mixing?
Well, my music involves thousands of tracks. So you can't put 1,000 tracks in a DAW and hope to mix them in one big mega mixdown. So I work with only 8 tracks at a time, 8 stereo tracks at a time. Usually one of the stereo tracks is a previous submix. And then I'll start layering using the other 7 tracks. And I'll do a submix of that to create a new stem. So then I'll take the stem, import that into a new session, and then start adding to that. And I'll do that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So I'm solving locally these mixing problems. And I'm only having to solve the problem of mixing 8 tracks at a time at any given moment. And by the end, I may have mixed 4,000 tracks.
Right. Damn, it's kind of like a collage, like an audio collage.
Yeah, it's one way to think about it.
What is it that's going on in Paris, you think? Like, I know there's so many like crazy technical musical people there. Like Urcam is there. I think you just said GRM are there. Like what? And I know you spent some time in Paris. What is it about Paris that you think makes them? I don't know, like how you. It just seems like there's a lot of crazy music technology stuff coming out of Paris or France in general, I guess.
Oh, it's a fabulous center for music in general, for composition in general, and for electronic music, and it always has been from the start. I mean, that's where the GRM got its start. Pierre Schaeffer, the musique concrète, that whole legacy. Xenakis was based there. He had his center, the Semamu, which I worked at, and Les Ateliers Hupik, which I worked at, the IRCAM, which I worked at, and there are others. There are hundreds of composers in Paris, and everybody's competing with everybody else. And your game has to come up. It's like the Old West, who's the fastest shooter. In Paris, who's the hottest composer.
And you don't think that same sort of musical competition exists in the United States?
Not so much. It's not really so much part of our culture. It's more, you do your thing, I'll do my thing.
That's fair. Yeah, I would say that's kind of the vibe here for sure.
Absolutely, and there's nothing at stake. There's very little at stake. Whereas in Paris, there's government money to run these centers, and if you win, I mean, like IRCAM is just this. The amount of money that goes in and out of IRCAM is incredible. There's a lot at stake there, and there's a limited number of people that get invited to make pieces there, and it's a kind of make or break situation. Again, a lot at stake.
Right. So software instruments and operating systems and like file formats and all this kind of stuff become obsolete surprisingly quickly these days. How do you approach long-term archiving of your pieces and custom tools and stuff so that like stuff that you made, 30 years ago is still able to be used these days?
Well, I do have all my old computers. I have computers from 30 years ago. And some of my software, I wrote myself, runs in Super Collider 1. I've done a great sounding granulator that runs in Super Collider 1. And the programs are from the late 90s. And I keep a I've got a laptop right behind me from that period that runs that software.
Mm. Do you think that kind of obsolescence of software and stuff is a technical problem that needs to be solved, or do you think that the fragility of it is kind of just part of the art?
Well, it's an unfortunate part of the art. I wish that there was stability. I studied computer science and I worked in the computer industry for many years, for about 10 years. And we were the companies that I was working for were constantly bringing out new software, making the old software obsolete. And it's how they make money.
Right.
It's kind of built into the system. Make a new file format. Now you control the gates of that particular file format. You define what it is, and everybody has to adapt to what you just defined now. And maybe you can start charging for that or license it. So it's just part of the business that these companies. It's part of capitalism. They have to bring out new products and make things obsolete in order to keep the capitalist system going.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just make a bunch of proprietary connectors and shit and make people pay $30 each for them.
Yeah.
You mentioned that through email when we were talking that one of your goals at this point of your life is to archive and document the past and take a bunch of stuff and donate it to the Computer History Museum in San Jose. What kind of things will be donated in that donation?
Well, I was the editor of Computer Music Journal and associate editor for 23 years. So I was at the center of a lot of information. And I was also writing, my textbooks. So I was contacting people. I was interviewing people for the Computer Music Journal and also for my own books. So I have tapes. I have photographs. I have posters. I have texts. I have books. I have vinyl. I have CDs. So that's the kind of it's mostly that type of material.
Nice. One thing I want to talk about is multi-channel audio. So we have like ambisonics and Dolby Atmos, 3D spatial audio and 7.1 and all this kind of stuff. But personally, I barely get to experience them. Do you ever see these multi-channel sort of setups becoming more standard, the same way that stereo did in the 50s or 60s? And if so, why or why not?
Well, I don't really like to predict the future, and I don't really know how to predict consumer tastes. So far, it hasn't worked in terms of a consumer format. In terms of a professional format, multi-channel is fantastic. I mean, we have here at UCSB the Allosphere, which is an incredible research facility with a 54.1 Meyer sound system. We also installed an 8.1 Meyer sound system in our concert hall, and both of those systems get used all the time. So if you have it in a professional environment that you have access to, it's fantastic. Other people have these systems now too, in Europe and all around the world. So if you get invited to one of these places or you go there and you have a chance to do a performance, the first time I did this was in Paris with the fantastic acousmonium of the GRM, the Groupe de Recherche Musicale, and they have a 48-channel sound system, and I used that in like 1993, and I was just hooked. I mean, it just sounded fantastic. Sound coming from all around the audience, and you can move it around in different ways, and it was very exciting. But in my home studio, I have stereo. And, I used to ask students when the 5.1 surround system was being promoted, how many of you have a 5.1? And nobody.
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive. Like buying a nice pair of stereo speakers is expensive, let alone, upping that cost by 2.5 or 3x.
Or people get these crappy, little tiny $20 speakers, 5 of them, and then it sounds crappy. They have the spatial audio, but it doesn't sound good.
Right.
So it's but it's a huge investment, like you say. I mean, I went to a studio about a year ago in Ojai, California, the studio of Bruce Botnick, a famous producer, and he had just installed a 17.1 Atmos system at great expense.
Mm.
But he produced The Doors, he produced all of Jerry Goldsmith. I mean, he's done, he's a major pop music producer.
Yeah, he's got the money for it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, just aligning a room acoustically with a stereo pair is hard enough, let alone trying to align a room around 7 or 8 or more sound sources.
Yeah, it is really what separates amateurs from professionals. But as I say, professionals, I consider myself a professional, but I don't want to go to multi-channel in my little studio.
Mm. How do you even begin to start mixing a mixdown for a 50-point sound system?
Right. Well, you need algorithmic help. For a small number of speakers, like let's say 8, I mean, I spent 7 years in Paris watching people do this live, right? Nobody was doing this with computer. It was all an analog mixing console. And you had this art of what's called, the French call diffusion or diffusion. I would call sound projection. And so if you practice it, if you have a few hours of rehearsal time, you can take a stereo track and learn you want to move it around in space in sync with the mesostructure of the composition after a few hours of play. And there are techniques for doing this. And it can be learned fairly quickly. But once you get up beyond 16 speakers, you need algorithmic help. And there are various software tools that can be used. I mean, I've developed one of my own, but I only use it, again, when I travel and when I have an assistant that can help set it up for me in the specific space.
Mm. And are you feeding this system just a ton of stems, or are you feeding it just a couple of stems, or is he feeding it just a stereo wave and it just somehow splits it up with FFT or something, or how's that work?
Right. Well, no, it loads it up. It loads the stereo. It splits them into left and right, and then the program that I developed, I call it Spatial Chords. It lets me press a button and stipulate how fast I want the two channels to move apart or together, how close they should be, whether they should be close or far away. And then there's another button that I can press to stop them. So at the beginning of a phrase, I'll have the two channels left and right start to move around the 360-degree space, above, below, around you. And then when I press stop, it will stop the two sounds at that position in space. When I press start again, it will pick a random new position for the two sources and then start to move them again. And I can do other operations like rotate the sounds around in a circle, or I can tilt the sounds either up or down as I'm moving. And I found that even with just two sources, if I'm moving around a 360-degree space, fully exploiting that 360-degree space, it's a very satisfying spatial feeling.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps even more satisfying, right? If there's two clear sources that are moving around you versus, say, 100 that are just going everywhere, it might just start to sound like a mess, and your brain might not be able to pass what's going on anyway.
Exactly. And what we did is we initially did experiments. I said, well, let's make 8 copies, and I'll make 8 of them move. And it was just too, again, like you say, a mess. The ear couldn't really follow what was going on. But with just two sources moving around 360 degrees, you can follow it. And it's interesting.
Yeah, I don't think we've really evolved to be able to hear millions of different things going around our head at any given time. We have latent inhibition that basically filters out a lot of stuff. And I think once too many things start happening, your latent inhibition just kicks in and filters it all out.
Something like that, yeah.
You've discussed composing at the micro level and at the larger meso and macro timescales. How would you describe the difference between these timescales?
Yeah, my colleague Horacio Vaggione at the University of Paris, he's one of the great composers of electronic music today. He sees no distinction. He subscribes completely to this idea of the multi-time scale outlook or perspective on composing, and he says that he composes all the time scales using the same techniques. I think that's partly due to the French uh, preference or cultural bias toward consistency, which he very much subscribes to. It's very important in French culture. They have this word called coherence, and if you're not coherent, that's like the most terrible insult that someone could say to you. It's you're not coherent because you're not consistent in every aspect of what you do. And I'm not such a subscriber to that, so I do treat them somewhat differently. At the micro level, one distinction is I can compose at the micro level algorithmically because I have my automated tools like my granulators. So that micro level is taken care of by the granulator. But then I will also go in at the micro level and apply a technique that I call micromontage, where I'm inserting or deleting or manipulating individual sound particles at the microtime scale. So my music is a combination of this automated granulation and micromontage. And then at the level of phrase structure, there's this notion of cadences of that the sound has a phrase has a beginning, middle, and end. The end is the cadence point. So my music is structured around phrases with cadential endings to them. And then at the mesostructure, my music is often separated into different sections. So that forms the macro form of the piece.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think, like, going back to sort of what we're talking about a second ago, where the brain at some point just taps out and like can't understand anymore, do you feel like we've almost hit a wall with what's capable of the brain being able to interpret in regards to sound? I feel like at some point, like, we're able to produce like the entire audible range, and we're able to manipulate it in all these crazy different ways, both on the time scale and the frequency scale and the phase scale. Do you think, I just feel like I haven't been like wowed by a new type of or a new technique of being able to do something in a while. I mean, AI is definitely impressive, but the results to me, they just kind of sound like other things I've heard before. What do you think about that?
Well, I won't get into AI right in this answer, but in terms of complexity, yes, there is a limit, and everybody has their own limits. And it's partly related to your attention and interest in the music. For example, when I was growing up as a student, in academia, the dogma of 12-tone or serial techniques was completely dominant. That's what I was taught, that you use these 12-tone techniques, and they can be very complicated and create structures that no one can hear. And the main composers of this music would admit that, yes, nobody can hear it, but that is the way that I compose. That's their system. So there's always this tendency to compose things that nobody can hear. My music has been criticized for being overly complex, and I I consciously use techniques to break up the complexity. That's where I use, for example, this cadential phrase structure. I'll stop the music and then restart it again, doing something different. And this is something that people have a real hard time with in electronic music. Students tend to make pieces that are like 10 minutes long and never stop. But it's more challenging as a composer to stop the music, restart, and do something new. That requires a new idea. And also you have to, the really algorithmically hard things that AI can't solve yet is starting and stopping. The algorithms that exist right now start in the middle and then end in the middle. They don't know how to start and stop. That's complicated.
Right. Yeah, I mean, me personally, issue, I think, with stopping a song in the middle and then just starting a completely new idea is I just have an anxiety of other people's attention spans. Like I feel like if I do that, someone else might listen to it and be like, oh, whatever, and just skip the song on Spotify, or if I'm playing a show, maybe like just leave or something like that. I guess that's like maybe where a lot of that comes from, is just people's anxiety of the listener and how it's going to be perceived.
Well, it doesn't mean that you have to shift to something utterly new, but it has to be, slightly different, let's say. But I also like to insert what I call singularities into my music, where the music will do something totally different for like 15 seconds and then go on as if that never happened.
Just as like what?
Yeah. I love that when that happens. I've heard other people do that, and yeah, it's one of my techniques.
Yeah, I fuck with it. I can hear your cat.
Yeah, she's very talkative.
Are there new types of synthesis being developed these days, or do you think like all of the synthesis types have been like created? There's kind of these buckets. There's like wavetable synth, subtractive, additive, granular, spectral. Is there like any new big buckets like that being designed, or is it all kind of just derivative and small tweaks on kind of like stuff that already exists?
Well, I think that there's always new techniques being developed. There's always new ways to process sound. There's this technique of physical modeling, for example, that there was so much hype about for so many years. And then Yamaha and Korg came out with products and nobody bought them. But there's still massive amounts of work being done in physical modeling, and that's a very powerful technique with lots of potential. As you mentioned, AI is going to play its role. I mean, I worked with a student last year that wanted to use AI neural net techniques in sound synthesis, and we developed a strategy for doing that. So, yeah, I think it's an open field. I wouldn't say that it's no, it hasn't all been used up, not at all.
Yeah, the thing that I kind of worry about is that, like I said before, it's just impossible to make something that's completely new to the point where it like creates a whole new like type of synthesis out of it, because I feel like each type of synthesis kind of has a sound to it, and our brains and ears are only capable of hearing so many sounds, and we've sort of heard all of the types of sounds now. But maybe not. I mean, maybe there'll be new sounds created where we're like, what in the actual fuck? But we'll see.
Yeah, I think there will be, but also I think that you're right that electronic music in its beginnings in the 1950s and 60s was just a period of wow, wow, wow. Hearing echoes for the first time, I remember, hearing backward sounds for the first time. Wow. Hearing sped up and slowed down sounds. Wow. So now they're familiar, but it's like, the sound of the piano is also familiar. Do you think you can't make good music with a piano? You certainly can. And you can still make great music with backward sounds, with sounds that speed up and slow down, and with echoes. I love all those things. But they're part of the cliches of electronic music now. But there's nothing wrong. I love them all. It's like the ingredients in cuisine. I mean, how many new ingredients can you invent? Not that many, but it's how you put them together. The old ingredients that makes the dish.
So it's all about the remixes now, like the recombinations of things.
Yeah, except
it kind of maybe has always been that.
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, I have a little trouble with the word remix. I wouldn't use it to describe what I do, but certainly, yes, we're always dealing with influences. I'm not saying that my music is entirely novel. I wouldn't want it to be. I think they're familiar. I'm quoting old electronic music all the time. I love the sound of the 1950s WDR West German electronic music studio. I've just incorporated all that 1950s sound into my sound. I love the sound of the RCA synthesizer from the 1950s and 60s. And I sampled as much as I could get from old records, and I just keep that in the sound file, and I'll put those sounds into my music from time to time. You can't make those sounds with any current synth. Somebody should make a new plugin that emulates the RCA electronic music synthesizer.
I'm not familiar with it, but I'm definitely going to look it up.
Yeah,
after
check
this.
it out. And if you look at the circuit, it's not like anything being made today.
In regards to physical modeling, do you see physical modeling stuff as a viable alternative to acoustic instruments, or do you think it ever will be? And do you think the goal really ever with physical modeling was to replace acoustic instruments, or was it just kind of a new fun technique to create different sounds?
Right. Well, that's a question with a complicated answer. I'll try to keep it simple. I think there were two goals in developing physical modeling. One was the scientific goal of emulating a phenomenon. When you get into a car today or you get into an airplane today, those devices have been completely simulated inside a computer and subjected to all possible external conditions in software. So that's how they learned by developing these models that the models were accurate or not, and they would improve them year after year. So that was the scientific goal. So, if you want to build a scientific model of a violin, as an acoustician, you will learn how the violin actually works by building a model. If it doesn't sound like a violin, you don't understand what a violin does. So that's one goal. The other goal is to develop these techniques that composers could use, and that could be either close approximations of the actual instrument, or interesting new hybrids, like a clarinet made of a different material than an ordinary clarinet, or a violin made of plastic or gold or copper. So I think, and that's all valid acoustically. Sounds that are not particularly accurate and don't correspond to sounds in the real world, but have real world qualities. So that was one goal. And one of the main goals of physical modeling was to model the transition between notes. We had samplers from an early time, but they model individual notes and they sound artificial. Like if you play a saxophone line on a keyboard sampler, it's not going to sound like a saxophone. It'll be the saxophone sound, but the articulations are not correct. Mm-hmm. So there's been a new wave of technology to incorporate these transitions between notes. And that's incorporated actually in some of today's samplers. Yamaha has a sampler that if you go from C to E, it'll play, or from G to E, it'll play a different E depending on which note you're coming from.
Yeah, that's a good point. I never really thought about that, like physical modeling software as a way to prototype building actual instruments. I never even considered that.
And then there's these fantastic models of piano we have now today. What is it? Pianotech, I think it's called.
Yeah, Pianotech's insane.
Yeah, so for $450 or something, you can get the sound of a $400,000 Bösendorfer piano. And it's licensed by Bösendorfer. That's how accurate it is. So, I mean, what if you could buy a cheap plastic violin? You know how to play a violin, and you buy a cheap plastic violin and you get the Stradivarius sound out of it. So that's a possible justification. But the problem of physical modeling has always been this one of how do you model the player? If you've got a plug-in running in your DAW, how do you get the sound of a violin out of a violin simulation? You'd have to adjust all the control lanes very precisely. You might have, for example, in the Yamaha VL1, there were 500 parameters to get a note. I remember playing the VL1 when it first came out. It had a keyboard, it had thumb wheels, it had a breath controller, and it had 2 foot pedals. And I was pressing all of them, and I couldn't get a sound out because something was off. So it's the matter of controlling a physical model that's always been the challenge. And for that, you would need to build, if you're trying to automate it, you need to build a kind of robot. It becomes philosophically very questionable, the motivation behind these kinds of things. But the people that build these physical models are just fascinated by models in general. It's a fascinating engineering problem.
In some of your writings, you've noted how certain accidents can enrich realism in physical modeling. In purely digital domains, do you have any techniques that you enjoy to cultivate meaningful accidents or serendipity in the digital environment where things are kind of designed to be perfect?
Well, I mean, my music is assembled by hand, but it's very much handicraft. So it's not perfect, right? I'm not trying to be coherent in the French sense. I'm just, so it's moment by moment. I'm making decisions, and they're I'm not aiming at perfection. Let's just put it that way.
Right. Do you have any thoughts on option paralysis? Like, I know these days when you're making electronic music, there's just like such a vast parameter space. How do you not get lost in that complexity and make sure that you're like constantly moving forward?
Well, there's a couple ways to think about that question. One I'll just address in terms of our app, Emission Control 2. We developed Emission Control as a research laboratory instrument. It has 80 controls on the front panel. It also, you can load an unlimited number of sound files into it. So it's potentially unlimited sound output in terms of the range of sound you can get, because any sound, and new sounds are being created every second. So there's an unlimited range of sound that this instrument can produce. And then it has 80 controls in the front. The parameter space is vast. And as a result, what we found out was you can spend a lot of time with the Emission Control 2 and not get something great out of it. It's hard to find the sweet spot with the Emission Control 2. It will do things that no other granular will do, but it will also, you can set there are many places where you can have the settings and no sound is coming out. Or you have no idea why some clicking sound is coming out. So one of the goals of our new granulator, which doesn't have a name yet, is to cut down that parameter space and also to provide a bunch of presets that users can start using immediately. So it'll be much easier to use and sound better right out of the box than Emission Control 2. Emission Control 2 can do it, but you got to do the work.
Yeah, I mean, for those listening who haven't used Emission Control 2, I highly recommend it. I love that granulizer. I use it pretty often, actually.
That's why we made it.
For those who want to get into the weeds with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. You've also stated that studio-based composition affords infinite undos and sort of precise multi-scale control. How do you feel about live improvisational, I guess is the word, electronic performance where the composer surrenders some of that control? Do you think it adds or removes things from the music?
Well, the thing about doing live is that you have to practice every day. You know, the people that are good at improvisers practice every day. So, you know, when you have someone that doesn't practice every day, gets up and do something live, it's not terribly impressive. But if you have people that practice every day and get up to do something live, it can be extremely impressive. I mean, my friend Earl Howard is one of the top live electronic music improvisers in the world. He played with the New York Philharmonic, LA Philharmonic, all the major orchestras in the past couple of years. He practices it every day. And that's one thing I learned. I don't want to practice every day. I'm lazy.
Yeah, I feel that. I get a lot more enjoyment out of sitting down and editing tiny little things and listening to them over and over again than I do with just like sort of practicing. So I've always found with electronic music, if you want to do like quote unquote live electronic music, you have to design the system in which you write the music from scratch. It's like not really possible to take something that you've produced in, you know, your standard way that you would in a DAW and then convert that to a way that you can play live. At least I've never had success with that and never seen anybody else have success with that personally.
Have you seen Richard Devine live?
Yeah, but that's exactly what I mean. Like he designs.
He's great.
Yeah, that system from the ground up is like, that's how he writes the music in the first place, is noodles around on the modular.
Absolutely. He's practiced.
So, exactly. And it works perfectly because it's like an exact, recreation of the process in real time. Whereas like the equivalent recreation of that process for somebody like me would be sitting at a computer listening to something on loop, and it wouldn't be enjoyable to watch for sure. So I'm curious to ask you about AI. What do you think about AI and the advancements in it?
Well, I don't have a lot to say about it. I was interested in AI in the 80s. I spent a lot of time at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab. At that time, we were developing what were called knowledge-based systems using the programming language Lisp. And Lisp has this fantastic feature that it has the Lisp interpreter built into the language, which means you can have a program that writes a program and then executes its own program. And indeed, that's how some of the first artificial intelligence examples were developed, where the answer to the understanding was defined as writing a new program that would do something. So you could say, move the block from the left side to the right side. That would generate a program that would cause a robot to move it from the left side to the right side. That was considered understanding. So it was program writing programs. That's a technology that is called knowledge-based systems. There's a lot of talk today about some of the problems of the current technology of AI could be solved by combining knowledge-based systems or expert knowledge with the brute intelligence, statistical intelligence of the neural networks. The current technology of machine learning is based on basically two algorithms. One is called gradient descent, and the other is called backpropagation. Everything that's AI today is two algorithms, gradient descent and backpropagation. And that can solve a lot of things, but it doesn't, for example, understand the rules of algebra. There are limits to what it can do in terms of mathematics because it doesn't understand mathematics. It doesn't understand specific domains. There's domain expertise that it doesn't understand. So a lot of people are trying to imbue this domain expertise into these general purpose large language models. And that might be one way forward for them to advance. And then the other thing that's been a problem that I guess been partially solved with this DeepSeek that came out a week ago is the idea that the current machine learning algorithms are a black box. They solve the problem, but nobody knows how or why.
Right.
And so this DeepSeek apparently can explain how it came to its answer of that its answers. So that could lead to a breakthrough. But, I'm just about to be 74 years old. I'm not going to start getting into this technology. If I would have been contacted by Google, let's say 10 years ago, to give them some musical direction, I could have helped them with that. But I read a lot of the Google AI papers, and they don't have a direction musically. They're just developing algorithms. Google has the goal of being able to have a camera and a microphone in any situation and understand everything that's going on. So it needs to understand sound. If Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is playing, they can say, oh, that's Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that this guy is listening to. He must like Beethoven. So it's this basically surveillance technology that's motivating all of this AI perceptual understanding. Because there's a lot of monetization from that understanding. So they're trying to understand music to the extent that one of these robots' surveillance systems can make some use of that. Otherwise, their musical goals change with every paper that they write. They try to solve different problems that are not that interesting. And they're really developing new algorithms. They're saying, well, here's the new algorithm we developed. How can we apply this to music? It's not starting from what are the important musical problems of today, and how can we solve those using this technology? And that would require a whole different mindset.
That's a dark way to look at it, that they're developing everything from a surveillance perspective, but it makes sense. I mean, that is exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, they want to be able to, like I say, have a robot that understands everything it sees and hears.
Right. Have you messed with any of the AI music software that's out there at the moment, like Udio or Suno or anything like that?
No, not yet. I'm sure that it'll be built into stuff that'll be very utilitarian. But so far, I don't need it. I mean, I have what the French call your petite cuisine. I have my techniques. I have my software. I've got everything I need right now. If somebody develops something cool, I'll look at it, but I don't necessarily need it.
Mm. Well, hey man, I appreciate you coming on this podcast. It was awesome to chat with you. What is it that you're interested in, or what are you working on now? That where should people go check you out? I guess is probably the best way to finish this.
Well, I have a couple of DVDs that came out a couple of years ago. One is called Point Line Cloud. The other is called Flicker Tone Pulse. And you can find them on Amazon. My book, The Computer Music Tutorial, second edition, came out about a year and a half ago, published by MIT Press. That's also on Amazon. Emission Control 2 is free, a download from GitHub. And like I say, we're developing a new granulator, but that'll take some time to get out. I have a new album coming out on a label called Ellie Records in the spring, and I'll be going to France and Italy to do some performances of that album.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for inviting me. Very interesting questions.